Hi everyone, it's Kelly here. Welcome to my channel if this is your first time. Welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you either way. On this channel we talk books, and today I am wrapping up the month of May, which is unbelievable to me that is where we are already in this year, because we're almost at the halfway point. So I did quite a bit of reading this month, so let's just get straight into it because I've got a lot of books to share with you. The first book that I finished in the month of May was Undiscovered by Gabriela Wiener. Wiener? I'm not really 100% sure how to say that. I'm pretty sure the W is a V sound. Anyway, apologies if I've mispronounced her name. This is now the second book that I have read by this author. I read her book Sexologies for my Around the World book club when we were reading for Peru. And this book was nominated for and longlisted for the International Booker Prize. It did not make the shortlist, but this was excellent. I loved this book. It was really great. I will say, having read her previous book, I had expectations about what I was going to find in this book, because in her previous book that I read, she talks very, very openly about sex and about her, the polyamorous relationship, I believe, at that time. And definitely in this book, she talks about that polyamory very, very openly. So I was expecting that was going to be part of this, even though that is not the main theme of this book. So the main theme of the book is that her great-great-grandfather was an explorer whose name was Charles, and he discovered... I'm doing very aggressive air quotes as I'm saying these things, discovered parts of Peru and Bolivia. And this is memoir, but it's also marketed as fiction. And in my my book club where this was being discussed, there were people who were very confused about if this was memoir or if it was fiction. Given that it's nominated for the Booker, it has to be fiction, but it feels very memoir-y. So I would say it doesn't fit neatly into either of those two categories. Personally, I think it tends more towards memoir. But this is a very personal sort of book, and she's sharing her thoughts on the very confusing legacy of being an Indigenous descendant of somebody, of a European who has come in and quote-unquote discovered your country. That's a really confusing legacy, and she also talks about this very complex polyamorous relationship where one of her partners, her male partner, is another Indigenous Peruvian person, and the other one is a white woman. And there's some very graphic, I would say, descriptions of her quote-unquote decolonizing the bedroom. So that was very, very interesting. And I know that won't be for everybody, so just heads up that's definitely part of this. I personally love her writing. I think it is so raw, and it feels like she's not holding anything back. I'm sure she is. I'm sure she's not telling us everything, but it feels very raw, feels very, very personal. And in that way that she's sharing her life, it's frank and it's thoughtful and it's challenging in the best way possible. I loved it. I loved it. And the very interesting thing, and this is sort of what opens the book, is her going to this museum where her great-great-grandfather's, things that he brought back from his travels in Peru and Bolivia are on display. And sort of that, it touches on that kind of theme of decolonization of institutions like museums and how things are presented and how the legacy of those things. Probably the most interesting part about this book, though, which I haven't yet talked about, is that in his writing, Charles talks about a young boy who essentially he purchases off of the boy's mother, who is depicted as sort of being down and out, drunk, I want to say, maybe it was, or maybe on drugs or something like that. But basically, you know, he paints her as this incredibly unfit mother, and then she agrees to allow Charles to take this boy. But then after a while, the boy is never referred to again. And when she's sort of doing this research, her focus is like trying to find what happened to this boy, because presumably he was taken back to France and was, you know, in some way, you know, utilized there, or was he treated like a son? Was he, you know, but there's not really any record. And so I guess that's where the novel part of this comes in, where she's kind of imagining what happened to this boy. And that she shifts the focus to the kind of more human element, whereas Charles's focus was very much on the, look at me, I'm discovering things, look at these artifacts, and she's like very focused on the people. And that was definitely an amazing aspect of this book that I think, you know, very much warrants reading. And I am definitely happy that I got this book and that I've read this book. I'm definitely going to come back to this at some point. I loved it, and it was a 5-star read for me. Okay, so that was my first book. Then I read a book from the library, which was a poetry... No, it's not poetry. I've previously read a poetry collection by this author. It's Cobby Eckermann. This is called She is the Earth, and it's sort of a... I would say it's kind of like... I think it's an extended poem. It's like a verse novel, kind of. Not really a verse novel. An extended poem is probably how you could describe it. It's very short. It's 91 pages long, and the pages look like this. So it's not textually dense on those pages, so it's a very quick read. This was a book that was long listed for the Stella Prize, and that's why I picked it up. And also I have read another book of hers. I read this last year or the year before, I think. It's called Inside My Mother by Cobby Eckermann. And this is a poetry collection, which I read. And I felt like this sort of felt more like a poetic saga. However, I thought this was I liked this a bit better than I liked the poetry collection, which I think I might have given 3.5 stars to. I gave this 3.75, so a slight improvement on the previous one. So I definitely enjoyed this more than the poetry collection, which I read. Oh yeah, I've written in my notes. I read it last May, so I will link up in the cards to where I reviewed that book if you are interested in hearing that review. This bamboozled me in the way that I like to be bamboozled by poetry, which, so it worked in that way. There was enough to grasp onto, but also more meaning existed beneath the surface, which you could kind of reflect on and think on. However, I finished this book on the 5th of May, and already I have basically forgotten it. So in many ways it was relatively forgettable, enjoyable at the time when I was reading it, but ultimately I've kind of forgotten about it, and I'm probably not going to revisit it. So it was fine, but not something that's stuck with me, if you know what I mean. Okay, then let's get on to a book that has stuck with me. And that is Western Lane by Chetna Maroo. Now this book has been nominated for lots of things, but the reason I picked it up is because it has been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Now, I was I bought this book back last year when whatever it was nominated for last year, this book came to my attention, and I was like, look, it's quite short, it sounds interesting, it's about squash. My husband plays squash, so I thought, I'll give this one a go. And then I put it down, and it wasn't until it was nominated for longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction that I decided to pick it back up again. Now, I don't know that I was necessarily expecting to love this book, but I loved this. I loved this book. This was a 5-star read for me. And basically what this book is about is there's 3 sisters, and at the very beginning of the book we find out that their mother has passed away very sadly. Young, she's not elderly. These sisters are relatively young, still at school. And their father kind of retreats into himself in many ways and becomes more distant than he was when their mother was alive. But one thing that he does is he decides that the girls are all going to train to play squash, which I'm assuming was sort of part of their life to a degree, but certainly not to the level that it becomes during the course of this book. So the narrator of this book is the youngest of the 3 girls, and these girls begin training every day to play squash, and the reason that he gives them is, he thinks that they need something to focus on. So he sends them to this place called Western Lane, where they are practicing every day. And the youngest of the 3 shows a lot of promise as a player. So he sort of then very much narrows his focus to her and training her to enter a squash competition. Now, I'm not a sporty person, which I'm sure surprises everybody, but I really, really found that aspect of things quite fascinating. I will say at the beginning of the book, this feels quite bleak. So I actually started reading it, and then I put it down for a while and didn't pick it back up for a while. But I'm so glad that I did, because I just thought to myself, oh, okay, I'll see if I can get this done. And then it was amazing. And actually, I have already talked about this book on this channel, because the day that I picked it up I was filming a reading vlog, which I will link to up in the cards. But so if you want to hear more about my experience of reading this book, or the second half of this book, then you can go there. But it begins in a very bleak way, which you can imagine, because it's about a family who have lost their mother and wife. But it ends in a hopeful way. It also made me cry. It was just beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. It was hopeful and joyful at the same time by the end. And I have heard people comparing Chetna Maroo's writing to Claire Keegan, and I think that is definitely a warranted comparison, because she has that same way that she sort of quietly and slowly builds her characters, and the plot of the book is not the focal point. You know what I mean? It's there, like there's definitely a plot that happens in the book and things move along, but that the focus is the reflectiveness and the characters. And I just loved this. It was 5 stars for me. Absolutely amazing, and I wasn't expecting it to be, so that was brilliant. Okay, the next one that I finished was a classic, and that is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And I actually listened to this one on audiobook, and the one that I listened to was narrated by Juliet Stevenson, the actress. And this one really surprised me. I've never read any Virginia Woolf before, so I didn't really know what to expect. But I really got along very well with her writing style and the way that she drew out the characters. So in this book, it's set over the course of one day. We open with Clarissa Dalloway, who is the Mrs. Dalloway of the title. And she's a wealthy socialite in her early 50s, and she's preparing to host a party in her London home. And meanwhile, other people who are connected with her in some way also are going about their days, and things happen to them. And the interesting kind of plot device in this book is that you jump between being in the heads of these different characters that you end up following, and it's when they kind of like pass ways in the street or something, so you kind of it's a very seamless transition into the next person's headspace. It's not done in a like when you have a multiple narrators in a book, you might have like a chapter that's dedicated to that one, and then it's the next person's, and it indicates to you that way. In this book, it's when they kind of like pass in the street, and I quite liked that, because it surprised me. So from the synopsis, I was expecting to stay inside Clarissa's head all day, but actually we jump between the narrators. The connections between some of the characters were a little bit unexpected, because initially when you kind of jump into certain people's heads, you're like, why are we in this person's head? That's weird. Like, it doesn't feel connected, but then everything kind of comes together by the end. And I also thought that the story of Septimus, who's one of the characters we go into his head, were also in his wife's head for a little while too. That storyline, wow. Wow. It's a lot. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but it really had impact for me, for sure. So I gave this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely would pick up more Virginia Woolf. Okay, the next one I don't have a copy of, and that's because I listened to it on audiobook, and that is What You Are Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama. Apologies if I've mispronounced that name. It was translated by Alison Watts. And I would say that the genre of this book is like cozy fiction. So essentially we have an enigmatic librarian who is the center of all of the stories. But each chapter is a different person's story. So it's actually kind of like a set of short stories that are all focused around this librarian recommending books that end up kind of changing their lives, essentially. But so her name is Sayuri Komachi, and she is this enigmatic, needle-felting giant librarian who has this like sixth sense about what the patrons of this library truly need when they enter the library, which is not necessarily what they're asking her for recommendations on. So her left field recommendations help these borrowers who are at some kind of a crossroads in their life work out what their path forward is going to be. That is essentially the format that each of these short stories take. Hence it being cozy. There's a level of predictability to it, but also the direction in which each person's story goes is different in each one. So it was super cute and cozy. I enjoyed it. Each patron is very like reflective on their little situation after reading this left field recommendation that they get from Miss Komachi, and they find a way to resolve their problem. It was sweet. I enjoyed it. It was a very enjoyable book, and I gave it 3.5 stars. The next book that I read, I'm just going to do a quick reorganization here because I've kind of hemmed myself in here and can't reach these larger books, so I'm going to bring them forward. Okay, my next book that I finished was Restless, Dolly, Maunder by Kate Grenville. This book has been shortlisted now for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and that was the reason that I picked it up. It's historical fiction. And we follow a woman called Dolly Maunder, who was born at the end of the 19th century into a poor farming family. And they live in country New South Wales, which is the state where I live. But she spends her restless life looking for essentially autonomy and like the next challenge. So this is kind of based on true things. So Dolly Maunder is Kate Grenville's actual grandmother. And this is the story, and she's imagining what her life was like. So she's taking factual information and creating a story. And essentially this is very much about what women went through. And it also feels like Kate Grenville was essentially trying to humanize and imagine who this person was, because her actual memories of this grandmother, because she died when she was quite young, were when she came to stay with them, which happens in the book. And she remembers not particularly feeling very loving towards this grandmother. So she wanted to then, like, you know, take this character of her grandmother and kind of situate her, because once she was able to do that, I think this was like a therapeutic, you know, sort of situation for her as she was writing the book, is my feeling. Now, I initially attempted to read the physical copy of this book, and I wasn't into it at all. Then I managed to get an audiobook copy from my library, and that was excellent. So I would 100% recommend reading this book on audiobook, because the narrator, who is an actress called Federae Holmes, does a fantastic job of narrating this book. And I think the way that she kind of lends her skills as an actress to creating this character made a big difference for me. It like helped me connect with the character more. So to me, Dolly reads as having ADHD, or autism and ADHD together maybe. And her husband, the guy she ends up marrying, to me felt quite autistic. So that was quite interesting. At a time when those labels did not exist, and also where the way that people who would have had those conditions would have been treated in a very different way to how they're treated today. So that was interesting. She was definitely a complex character. She was not 100% likable, and some of the things that she did, you could see how that affected her relationships with her children and her husband and so on. However, you know, she wasn't always easy to love, but some aspects of that were because of the times and also the circumstances of her life. So in the end, I actually found her to be a really likable character. So I've heard people talking about her as being incredibly unlike, like a horrible person, and I did not get that impression at all. Yeah, and maybe that is in part to do with the way that Federae Holmes narrated the book, but I actually think it was the writing. So I actually found her quite likable and I could understand why she did made the decision she made and did the things that she did. So yeah, I really enjoyed this in the end, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So I will be interested to see what ends up being the winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction. And this has been quite a controversial inclusion in that shortlist, because a lot of people did not like this book, but I really did like this book. So I'm glad that I did persist with it and read it in the end. Okay, so that was that one. So, oh God, the next book that I read, and you'll all be very pleased when I stop talking about this. If you've been following along with my interactions with this book, you will know that this has been the bane of my existence for this month, and that is Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. This book won the Stella Prize and has now been nominated for the Miles Franklin Award which is our big literary award here in Australia. So once it, I wasn't convinced that I was going to finish this book, even after it won the Stella Prize, but then when it was nominated for the Miles Franklin Award, I was like, well, I've got to finish it now, because I would like to try and read all of the books this year from the Miles Franklin, though I will DNF if I really am not enjoying it, because this was a slog for me. But let me tell you a little bit about the book. Essentially, we've got a small town in Australia, and it is dominated by this haze cloud, which seems to be, sort of an ecological disaster situation. So there's definitely an element of this being climate change fiction, as in fiction around climate change. I'm not saying climate change is fiction. This book is fiction, and there's a speculative element to it in terms of what could happen because of climate change and because of humans not taking care of the earth, etc. So it's that, and it also is a gathering of the ancestors, because this is Alexis Wright is an Aboriginal Australian author, and this is definitely a very Aboriginal book, and so she's sort of exploring a lot of themes, as I said, around climate change, but also around the way that Aboriginal people are treated and speculatively could be treated in the future by the Australian government, and by the people of Australia. And also she is kind of thinking, she's using a lot of elements of Aboriginal storytelling as part of this book. So we follow essentially a family, and this is the Steele family, and all of these characters have weird names, so just bear with it. The first character that we follow is Corsman Steele, and he is a very annoying character, and that is stated in the book. The other people in the town where he lives don't like him. They don't like the decisions he's making. He sort of is portrayed as sort of being pompous and like somebody that you might be very dismissive of because you think they're just a bit mad. But he is essentially, his big theme of the book is he thinks that he's going to help his people survive the impending doom of climate change by establishing a freight system based on using donkeys. And in this book, where there's a lot of these donkeys who are feral donkeys, and he is rounding up these donkeys to try and establish this. So he sort of thinks of himself as like being this massive visionary who is, people just don't get it, but he's going to save his people and also make some money. His wife is called Dance, and initially I was quite drawn to this character because she seemed to like be the kind of character that I would have liked to have followed. And she's seeking solace from her husband, who she definitely doesn't agree with him about his plan, especially because he ends up kind of bringing all these donkeys in and it's, not really doing his due diligence to take care of them. So it sort of falls to her to look after these donkeys and make sure they don't die. But she is very focused on butterflies and moths and so on, and she is very in tune with them and watching them in nature, and kind of gets carried away a little bit with the butterflies. But then her story kind of turns partway through the book as well, and she starts to scour the internet to find out how she can seek repatriation for her Aboriginal Chinese family. So she has a dual heritage of Aboriginality as well as a Chinese heritage. And she's like emailing the Chinese government to try and do that. That's her plan to get out of this town. And then we also follow their two children. So the oldest of their two sons is called Aboriginal Sovereignty. And yes, it is a very obvious allegory for actual Aboriginal sovereignty as well as being a human. And so we follow him, and he sort of is like the hope of the town. Everyone sort of thinks that he's like going to do something important with his life and so on. And his story, I think, is actually the most interesting and the one that I was the most interested in. But he is determined to commit suicide. And then we also follow the younger son, who is called Tommy Hawk, and he also is very invested in his brother committing suicide because he thinks that that is necessary for him to survive, because he has to get rid of the brother. So he wants to, his dream is to become white and powerful and to move to Parliament House in Canberra, where he has this like imagined the white mother who is like the protector of Aboriginal people, Aboriginal children specifically, and he is sort of like representative of how, you know, the kind of negative politics and talk pieces and so on about Aboriginal people. If, you know, he takes all of that on board and starts to believe all of those things about his own people and wants to have nothing to do with it. So this is allegorical, this novel, but it is also sort of, it's a fable, it's speculative. It definitely pushes the bounds of what a novel is. Personally, and I hope not to have to talk too much more about this book after this video. Personally, I did not like this book. I do not understand why this won the Stella Prize, because I, having read most of the other books on the long list and short list, there were definitely books in there that I thought worked better than this one. There were definitely some profound moments in here, and the one that comes to mind is a scene where a teacher is defending a student from the police. That was really poignant. I had tears kind of prickling in my eyes during that scene. Maybe that's because I am a teacher, so like I kind of identified with that situation, but and there were definitely some beautifully written passages. So Alexis Wright definitely can write, but it felt like this book needed a massive, massive edit. And I just wonder if the kind of the spectre of Alexis Wright as being like our amazing author who has previously won lots of prizes with her other works in the past and so on, whether that kind of limited the amount of editing that happened in this book, or whether like that is just the way that she writes and we just accept that, and that there are genuinely people who are believing that this is the great Australian novel, because I've certainly heard lots of people saying that, and there are lots of 5-star reviews of this book online. So, you know, maybe it's me, but I don't think it's me. I'm a relatively intelligent person. I was following what was happening, but it was really hard to follow. It was hard to follow the thread, and then there were parts of it that just felt like dragged on for so long, and it felt very long-winded. And this is a tiny bit of a spoiler, but it didn't feel like there was a payoff at the end either. Like I pushed through because of all of these 5-star reviews and people saying this is the great Australian novel, and I figured that there would be something at the end that kind of pulled things together in a way that would help me understand why that is the case. But that did not happen for me at all. I endured this book, is how I am describing it. there was insufficient plot to keep me interested. The characters were all awful in their own way, unlikable, which made it much harder for me to care about what happened to them. And the author had some important things to say in this novel. I could see threads of things that needed to come together that didn't come together. Her messages got a bit lost, I felt, in this very repetitive prose. Ultimately, this book did not deliver for me at all on what it promised, and it did not get better as it went along. I enjoyed it. So I gave this 2 out of 5 stars, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. Thanks. Okay. The last book that I've finished in the month of May was Autumn by Ali Smith. This was one of the books that I had on my 24 in 24 list. So at the beginning of, or at the end of last year, I picked 24 books off my shelf that I was excited about, that I definitely wanted to get to this year. And this was one of them, so I have now ticked another one off the list, which is good because I am falling terribly behind on that list. It's tricky during the season of prizes because I really want to read prize books. I'm hopeful that I will navigate my way back to that list once I'm done with the Miles Franklin Award. But I really enjoyed this. So this was, we are following 2 characters. We've got Daniel, who is also known as Mr. Gluck. He is in what appears to be an aged care facility. Yes, I think that is how they describe it. And he is very much retreated into his dreams. He sleeps on and on. Some years ago, he had befriended his young neighbor, or she had befriended him. And she was a precocious preteen who is now grown up and is our other narrator, and she is his only visitor. This was quite wholesome, I felt, and intriguing at the same time. Mr. Gluck is this very complex character. He had a very interesting life, and that is kind of slowly revealed as the book goes on. And his relationship with Elizabeth is so lovely, the girl who is now a woman. The way that the story unfolded was very satisfying. The conclusion was perfection. So yeah, I really, really loved it. And I was very interested in learning more about Pauline Boty, who is an artist who was referenced in this book. And I subsequently went on to kind of look through my books to see if I could find out some more information about her. And I did find her in a book that I have on pop art, because she was a pop artist. And that was a really interesting sort of aspect to this book that I really appreciated, because I do I enjoy reading about art. So yeah, I was very pleased to see that kind of come into this book. I gave this one 4 stars. I'm really glad I read it, and I'm going to continue with the seasonal cycle. So my next one, because it has now ticked over because we are now in June, so it is now technically winter, which means I can pick up the winter book from the quartet and continue on with it. So very pleased to have actually managed to get through this in autumn, because it has been sitting on my shelf for a couple of years now, and I've really wanted to get to it, but I haven't managed to pick it up in the autumn, and I've kind of felt like I needed to, though I would say realistically it's not really the case. You don't have to read this in autumn, but it's kind of fun to do it. Anyway, so those are the books. Those are the books that I have read. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 books, which I think is the most that I've read. The most that I have read in a month so far this year. So that's good. I'm pleased about that. I'm pleased that I managed to get through so many books. Now, there were a couple of books that I'm almost done with that I've been reading throughout this month as well. So I'll be finishing those ones off in June and will very happily be talking to you about those. I've been reading Doppelganger. I've been reading a book about tractors in Ukrainian. What's it called? It's called A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian. I've been reading Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, and I've been reading Enter Ghosts by Isabella Hamad. So I'll have reviews of those when we come back for next month's wrap up. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with me or disagree with me about any of the books you've read, but please, no more talk about Praiseworthy. I am done. I am done talking about this book. So yes, let's pretend that we're done with this one. But let's talk about the other ones. If you've read them, or if any of these reviews have made you interested in picking any of them up, I'd love to hear that too. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye!